Fellas, you know Degree Cool Rush deodorant, right? Well, last year they changed the formula, and guys were mad about it. One dude even started a petition. So guess what? Degree heard us, admitted they messed up, and brought the original Cool Rush scent back exactly how it was. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So grab some and remember why its cool, crisp, and fresh scent made it the #1 men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory for all of us.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Not everyone is careful with your personal information, which might explain why there's a victim of identity theft every 5 seconds in the US. Fortunately, there's LifeLock. LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats to your identity. If your identity is stolen, a US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year by visiting lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University. And I'm joined, as usual, by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Ken, welcome to The Politics Guys.
Great. As always, it is great to be back.
It is. You know, I got to go. It was a lot of fun. I got to do the show with Mike just recently. We don't get to do that often. But, you know, we are the classic team, Trey and Ken. So here we are.
I'll take it.
Yeah, exactly. We're the real reason that you all are listening today. We know it. And that's fair. But there is a lot to go through today. And one of those really big items that all of the politics guys really thought were a key one for the two of us to cover were the first 100 days. And so that's where I kind of thought we would start, Ken, by discussing a number of big Trump items. There's a lot of things that have happened this week, but to not just kind of limit ourselves to those, but really to try to assess the impact of President Trump's first 100 days in office, which occurred just this past week on Wednesday, or April 30th. And just a bit of context for listeners, this number gets thrown around a lot. You see it in the media a lot. You know, the president, it is day 10 of 100. You know, why these 100 days? You know, it's a 4-year term. Why the 100 days? The context for that is Franklin Roosevelt. Political scientists specifically, and historians in different kinds of contexts, we really mark the beginning of the American presidency into what's often called the modern era, based on presidential power. And it is FDR who is seen as being that turning point for the presidency. Now, there can be some arguments about whether and how warranted it is that FDR is singularly the reason, but be that as it may, in kind of a broad strokes brush, the FDR moment is certainly when we start measuring things fundamentally different before the pre-modern and the modern presidency. And FDR is empirically the first president to really propose and push for things like major legislative changes. And we're going to talk about some of those from Donald Trump. He would also use the idea of the first 100 days as a rhetorical device, as part of a package of reasons for voters to be excited about what he's doing and moving forward. And so we now kind of benchmark presidents often from their first 100 days. And there's actually an irony in that, Ken, because, of course, at the time, Republicans were really kind of appalled by the activity of FDR, and Democrats... And Democrats lauded it, but today, kind of like free trade and protectionism, I think the parties have swapped a little bit on that. I think today, you know, Democrats are going to be a little more cautious of presidential power, and Republicans are going to be a little more lauding of presidential power. But, you know, I thought we'd start here. And one of the items I wanted us to think about in the first 100 days Ken, from my point of view, is kind of maybe Trump's own metric. And by Trump's own metric, one of the things that he said is centrally important is the stock market and economic indicators. And there is evidence this week, we have our first kind of big report, that the economy is in fact shrinking. And the stock market, as we covered earlier in response to many of his unilateral trade tariffs, has at best been a mix and a swirl and an unknown. And the market doesn't hate anything more than uncertainty of that variety. And so there's a lot of reasons to suggest that while in Trump's first 100 days, he has probably accomplished a lot unilaterally, but I think it is definitely up in the air whether most of us are going to consider that a lot to be a good thing for us as a country and as a whole. So, Ken, kind of starting there, what are your thoughts about the first 100 days, maybe on markets? We'll move through some other items too.
Yeah, I mean, first, one difference I think between FDR's first 100 days and Trump's first 100 days, even though they could both be seen as periods of great expansion of executive power, is that FDR, had won huge majorities in the Congress, and most of his expansion of executive power that he achieved quickly was accomplished through legislation, that Congress actually enacted laws that gave him the powers that he was asking for. And that's really very different than Trump's, where Congress, I think that they've enacted the one Lake and Riley Act, which affects some immigrants, but other than that, zero legislation. So I think that
He said the fewest pieces of legislation of any modern president to this point in his first 100 days, for some context there.
Yeah, I mean, and besides the one statute I mentioned, the Lake and Riley Act, he got the continuing resolution, so the government didn't shut down. The doors got to stay open for till the end of the year, and other than that, just renaming some post offices and things like that. So really, no substantive legislation. So all of Trump's power grabs have been through executive orders. All of that is subject to review in the courts. He has not been faring so well. So things looked, when he does things, it looks like he does things. But when the court rules, a month later that was illegal and has to be undone, then he hasn't really done as much as it first looks like. And also, even when he occasionally is able to, persist in, doing something through executive order, not having a court reverse it. Well, of course, the next president can reverse all that instantly because any executive order could be rescinded by a later executive order. So I don't think anything he has accomplished, even though, he's been fast moving and he's done a lot. I really, would suspect that there's not a lot of lasting impact there of much of it. And part of that is because he's actually really failed after it looked like initially he might succeed a bit at realigning the priorities of the country. And, even just 100 days in, everything he's doing is wearing pretty thin with the country. And not only are the courts going against him very consistently, but public opinion very slowly is also turning against him. I'd say slowly but steadily, so that, when he came in, a little more than half the people gave him a positive approval rating. And now he's down around 40% positive approval rating because of the kinds of things he's done. And I think that makes it less likely that he's really made any significant kind of permanent realignments the way FDR was able to do in a lot of respects. Or by permanent, I mean FDR's realignments largely lasted about 80 or 90 years. Maybe they're coming to an end now. But that's what I'd say about that. I didn't know if you also wanted me to address the issue about the markets or if you wanted to comment on that first.
Well, I like that kind of big picture to start with, Ken. And you bring up a really important point that political scientists, especially, I'm a presidency scholar, that's my area. But this tension between, there's this really famous political scientist, presidential scholar, his name is William Howe. He writes this book on executive orders a number of years ago, and it really shifts the way we think about presidencies and argues a little bit counterintuitively to what you were saying there, that presidents, as we move forward, will want to do fewer things in terms of big legislation and do more things in terms of unilateral power. because it behooves their ability to get things done rapidly. And it's fascinating to me because it seems in many ways that Trump is the kind of maybe the ultimate expression of that. And what you're suggesting effectively is that it won't have the kind of longer lasting impact that it might had he had more of the FDR legislative bit. But in some ways, he himself will be a useful empirical study, because this is a question that often comes up. Is it rhetoric and unilateral power that makes presidents so strong, or is it in our system their ability to bully effectively Congress into doing what they want to do to get long-term outcomes? So I do think that he is going to be a key example of that. I think we're going to be studying this for a long, long time. So I like that you set it up that way, and you're taking a side in that, whether you realized it or not. But I would like to hear your thoughts in terms of the market, because again, when former President Biden was in office, this is precisely the metric by which Trump said presidents ought to be measured. So it seems fair to measure him to begin with by his own benchmark. So what are your thoughts on Trump's own benchmarks for himself?
I think maybe this will sound like I'm being unfair to Trump, but I generally think that presidential policies don't have a direct day-to-day impact on markets so much. And in fact, if you look both at Trump's first term and at Biden's first term, both of them had the experience of 3 out of their 4 years in office, the markets did very well. 1 out of their 4 years in office, the markets did very poorly. Both of them had that. And I think, in fact, for both of them, it was the second year of 4 that the markets did very poorly. So whatever policy differences they had between each other, Biden's term and Trump's first term, you couldn't have told that by looking at the performance of the markets. But I do think that the markets now, are being negatively impacted by Trump, because what Trump has done with these tariffs is extremely unusual and has a kind of very direct negative impact on business. One thing that, though, still makes me say it doesn't track one-to-one, and I have a hard time understanding it myself, is the markets under this Trump term did very poorly during his first quarter, and he had not yet announced the tariffs during his first quarter. Now, his so-called Liberation Day, he very consciously and strategically, I think, waited for April 1st, the day after the end of the first quarter, so that whatever negative impact the announcement would have on stocks, it wouldn't impact those first quarter results. But as it happened, the first quarter results were already miserable. Now, in the month since April 1st, he announced the tariffs, and predictably the markets plunged, but they've come all the way back to where they were on April 1st, right? So if you look right now, the markets had a miserable first quarter, and that never came back. And then in the first month of the second quarter, they got off to a miserable start, but then came all the way back to where they were at the start of the quarter. So it doesn't provide strong evidence that the tariffs are the thing that's hurting the market, but something about Trump seems to be hurting the market. And I would say it's just the general uncertainty. And that was, already being felt even before he announced the tariffs.
I think that's a really astute point, Ken. And I think it is very easy, and it's always easy to that's one of the reasons that presidents use unilateral powers, is voters have increasingly shifted their focus to what the president's doing. And we kind of today view the president as more being kind of a Steve Jobs or a Cook, where they're in control of a much more direct way, control of a business. But that is not how the presidency, even the more expanded modern or postmodern presidency, depending on what scholarly view you're taking a look at, is. And there is a lot of economic research on this, particular kinds of policies. It's not that they don't have economic impacts, but this desire to see them in the short term And by short term, we're not even talking in terms of quarters, right? We're talking in terms of, deep numbers of years to pan out to kind of really to see those impacts. So I agree with your assessment there. I would highlight a little bit more. I do think it's a little more empirically obvious that it is the chaos of the Trump presidency that has created the current market turmoil, because I think underneath that market turmoil is 100 days that have been marked by businesses not knowing how it is they can operate, from where they can bring people in, whom they can hire, what's going to be on a variety of factors, of which tariffs are but one, I think, very prominent and loud example. But I mean, to give you a concrete example of, I think, longer term market issues, May 1st, we saw a number of companies, prominent among them. I'll out myself. I have before as a gamer, right? The Microsoft Corporation announced effective March 1st, far outweighing the increase for their consoles and other hardware in other countries, which are going to go up a little bit by about 2 to 4%. Here in the United States, they're going to go up closer to 33%, and that's already happened. And so that means for kind of their top of the line video game console, but which is now a number of years old, right? We're almost out of that generation. They're raising that from a $400 price point to a $500 price point. And generally speaking, kind of electronics and those kinds of items over the course of their life, they decrease in price. They don't come up. And so to see something this deep into its life cycle coming up from a big company like Microsoft, I think is telling, and they are not alone. You take a look across the board, we are seeing some pretty dramatic price increases. That's one of the reasons the Trump administration was deeply worried about Amazon, potentially pointing that out. I do think that unlike other items, that we're going to see some more immediate term effects from some of these Trump policies. But I do agree with you. To this point, it is primarily just the uncertainty of it. Thoughts about that, Ken?
Yeah, I mean, so another thing about the tariffs, I think we're recording right now today on May 2nd, and I believe today, is this right? Is today the very first day that products coming into ports are actually going to have to pay the tariffs?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons we're seeing all of these, May 1 shifts in price, like from Microsoft.
So the tariffs are announced a month ago, and they caused a lot of churn in the market so far, but nothing that really moved the market over the course of a month. Even though if you looked at it over shorter terms within that month, it would look like it was moving a lot. But still, nobody's paying the higher prices yet. That's all just based on the idea that people are going to be paying the higher prices. Now, in stock investing, they have this theory called the efficient markets hypothesis that says, information like that is already baked into the prices, right? So as soon as we know on April 1st that all the consumer prices are going to go up in May, then that's already being baked into the prices in April. That's the efficient markets hypothesis. But I wonder how completely true that is. And, we're pretty soon, and we haven't really hit it yet, going to be at the point where, the Walmarts and the Target stores of the world are going to have a lot less stuff on their shelves. The prices of a lot of ordinary things are going to go up a lot, like the consoles that you were just talking about. Even more so, I think, in the area of things like toys, where almost all toys are made in China. And so it may be that, that part of what the efficient markets hypothesis has been baking into the price is the idea that there's a reasonable probability Trump would actually pull back on some of these tariffs. And so, if the dice get rolled and that contingency doesn't happen, and what happens is that he sticks with the tariffs, that could cause more downward shocks. But it's just really hard to know, because so many things get baked into pricing, and some adverse things that happen, it's already been anticipated that they would happen. So the gets baked into the price earlier than when they do happen. So I think nobody, if I could really predict what's going to happen to the markets, I wouldn't be, wasting my time teaching law at school, because it's a lot easier money to make in the stock market if you actually know what's going to happen,
Well, and I like that you put in that context, because I want to talk about a few other items too before we move forward. But I follow a number of market individuals. Probably most prominently among them is Louis Navellier, who is probably one of the biggest market predictors, has one of the most maybe one of the fancier models for thinking about markets, stocks, etc. And reading him recently, Ken, has been a very insightful, I think, into the fact. As a matter of fact, I'll be honest. I'm betting the other direction. I don't think that individuals like Navalier, I know for a fact, based on their statements and their postures and their predictions, none of them thought that Trump was going to do this, and none of them thought that tariffs are going to be harmful. It's been funny, as a matter of fact. Navalier, in many ways, obviously has some anti-American biases that not become until recently, when he started pointing out, well, this is just all the foreign press giving Trump a hard time. This isn't going to happen. This isn't a big deal. And I thought, man, for a guy who can create a pretty complicated economic model, you're an idiot. If you really think, this is all just the foreign press.
Right.
And he's made that.
So I think under that efficient markets hypothesis, the hypothesis would assume that some investors think like the gentleman that you're talking about, and some investors think differently. And so, when you look at all the money that goes into the market, it reflects that range of views, but that's essentially the same thing as assigning a probability distribution, right? So like if 30% of the people are investing based on the idea that the tariffs are going to be withdrawn before they do any harm, and 70% of the people are investing based on the idea that the tariffs aren't going to be withdrawn and they are going to do harm, then that essentially is pricing the stocks to that 30% discount for the harm. And so that is sort of the way it sort of assumes that the aggregate of all gamblers approaches something like the truth, right? And so that might or might not be true, I guess.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at a few other items. We don't want to just focus on the market. Things happened this week as well. I mean, one of those, of course, is the U.S.-Ukraine resource deal, right? So on Wednesday as well, right there marked on the 100 days, I can't help but see that as having been a little bit purposeful. The United States and Ukraine finalized a minerals agreement, which theoretically is aimed at ending the war, although on television, Rubio and others have really indicated that the president's kind of done with that. But the goal here is to boost Ukraine's post-war reconstruction and economic resilience. And there's going to be a joint, the principal piece of this is there's going to be a joint U.S.-Ukraine reconstruction investment fund in which both sides contribute equally. Now, the Ukraine will retain full ownership over its resources, and all profits from the fund will be invested into Ukraine for the first decade. It also includes tax and tariff-free terms and grants the Ukraine control over its mineral licensing. Significantly for the war, though, Trump now has authorized $50 million in military aid for Ukraine. That is the first of such support since he has taken office, and also quickly followed on comments from him via Truth Social earlier that Putin presumably ought to, quote unquote, stop. Now, this is the same deal that was supposed to have been signed weeks ago, but ended up in that contentious meeting between Vice President Vance, President Trump, and Ukrainian President Zelensky. And it's primarily, obviously, and importantly, symbolically, for Trump to attach himself to Ukraine, and probably marks the furthest step he's had away from Russia, at least symbolically, again, in a number of weeks. But again, the quick backtracking from individuals like Rubio on what the future of the United States and Ukraine would be in the face of this war seems to mitigate some of that symbolic nature. What does this kind of foreign policy day, right on the anniversary of his 100 days, how do you see that fitting into the foreign policy of the Trump administration, Ken?
Well, you know me, I'm always looking at things through the lens of Trump being Putin's puppet. And I still think I'm going to look at this through that lens. This one may look a little bit different because, as you say, it does, end up in Trump finally releasing, what I would call a relatively token amount of military aid to Ukraine. But it's something because he's otherwise previously refused to release any. But I look at it primarily as, Trump has not committed the United States to anything, right? He's unleashed a little bit of money. He's, perhaps symbolically tied some U.S. economic interests to a situation in Ukraine where maybe there's enough peace that mining operations and things like that can be done without being, bombed. But I think ultimately there's no firm commitments here that he couldn't, just instantly walk away from. And I take this to really just be that he got stymied, in his effort to essentially force a surrender by Ukraine, which is what he was trying to do when Zelensky came to the White House back in February. He couldn't get that done. He ended up, looking kind of ineffectual to the point that, there's pressure even from Republicans in the United States. It looked like all our allies were basically, this was going to be their big opportunity to escape from the yoke of U.S. leadership, and that they were going to actually go try to help Ukraine defend itself, even if we weren't, which would have been kind of humiliating for the United States to just be not participating in an operation that the rest of NATO would be participating in, because it would sort of show that we don't have leadership in that organization anymore. So I think he kind of got backed into a corner where he had to do something that would look like some kind of support for Ukraine. And what he actually did was the minimum possible given those dynamics.
I think this is of all the points, I think this is the most straightforwardly and obviously humiliating from Trump from an empirical point of view, not in terms of the deal itself, but in the terms that it comes in the first 100 days after Trump repeatedly and straightforwardly said that he could end the conflict in 24 to 48 hours. And we are now definitively 100 days through. And not only is there no indication that there is an end to that kind of conflict, but even as you're saying, even kind of one where one side capitulates is obviously not going to happen. And given the strength of Ukraine's defensive posturing, it seems likely that for a significant portion, at least, of Trump's time in office, he's going to have to continue to deal with a conflict that he said was preventable, that he would have stopped, and obviously would have stopped, again, 24 to 48 hours. I mean, it is, I think, one of the most singular, most humiliating historic moments that he's going to have to suffer. Now, I don't think that he really cares in that sense, but he is egotistical. I mean, you can't get much more of a failure than what he promised versus what has happened in terms of foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine.
Because his plan to end the war in a day was to side with Russia and force Ukraine to capitulate. And
right.
He did try that, and it didn't actually force Ukraine to capitulate.
Yeah, because why would they? I mean, again, I think he had this assumption that he was just going to kind of sit down with Zelensky and be like, well, look, you've lost. We all know it. Let's all move on. Let's be friends. I mean, yeah, that seemed to be the strategy, right?
Yeah. He literally said to Zelensky, you don't have any cards to play. He could not see that, Zelensky could possibly keep going once he pointed out to Zelensky that Zelensky didn't have cards to play. And Zelensky said, we're not playing cards. And he's got some ability to keep fighting, and he's got some support from every other NATO country.
The last thing I'll think in terms of the foreign policy in this Ukraine deal, it is going to be, none of us, I think, rightfully assessed the longevity of Ukraine. I think that you and I had slightly longer predictions than the other hosts, right? I remember that Mike and Jay early on in that conflict said, look, this isn't going to last but 30 seconds, not literally 30 seconds, but it's going to be a really short time frame. We put that time frame a little bit longer than did our co-hosts, but
yeah, but not even this long. I'll concede it. I didn't think Ukraine could hold out this long, but it happened also because Biden gave them quite a lot of support.
Absolutely, and that's what leads me, I think, is going to be a legacy of the first 100 days. It becomes less likely without significant independent European support that Ukraine can hold out. Like you mentioned, the $50 million involved in this deal, and that's a drop in the bucket, and we're going to be seeing that kind of problematic frontline fallout, I think, within the next couple of years. I believe that one of the other biggest failures of the Trump administration is if Russia ends up victorious in large part over Ukraine during Trump's period, at least from our standpoint. Now maybe he'll be happy about that, but I don't see that as being anything but yet another stain on the Trump presidency. Quick little thoughts on that before we move forward.
Well, I agree it would be a stain on the Trump presidency, but I don't know that he would see it that way. I think that's actually what he was going for at that February White House. The very thing you say would be a stain, he saw as his actual objective, but yet he failed to bring it about.
I think in Trump's view, the goal would basically be to give kind of almost half of Ukraine to Russia. But I think that the totality of Ukraine being conquered by Russia would sit differently even among the MAGA crowd. But maybe I'm wrong about that.
I think he's trying to turn the MAGA crowd towards, totally against Ukraine, so that that the MAGA crowd would really, revel in their total defeat. But that's how I see what he's trying to do. But I don't think I don't think that's gone anywhere beyond the MAGA crowd, and most of the Americans are still not part of that MAGA crowd.
Well, let's continue. Let's do one more big item here, because, again, it relates to thinking about Trump in these 100 days. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz is leaving his White House post, and he is to be nominated, according to Trump, to be the next ambassador to the United Nations. His deputy, Alex Wong, is also expected to be out as well, and that seemingly is official as of May 2nd, today, which is Friday. In the interim, President Trump said that Marco Rubio is going to add yet another hat and will now also be the National Security Advisor. Is there anything that man can't do? In addition, of course, to his primary role as Secretary of State. Yeah, go ahead. Make your snark. Come on, that's fair.
How much time you think he spends on his job heading up the National Archives?
Well, if Marco Rubio knows when an archive is, I owe you a Coke. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
But yeah. So as he wrote on Truth Social, he said, "I'm pleased to announce." Excuse me. As he wrote in his statement, not on Truth Social, as he wrote in his statement, "I am pleased to announce that I will be nominating Mike Waltz to be the next United States ambassador to the United Nations. From his time in uniform on the battlefield in Congress and as my national security advisor, Mike Waltz has worked hard to put our nation's interests first. I know he will do the same in his new role. In the interim, Secretary of State Marco Rubio will serve as national security advisor while continuing his strong leadership at the State Department," end quote. Now, honestly, though, despite that framing, it seems very likely that this was a way to move Waltz aside without having to fire him in the wake of the Signal fiasco. But this does mean that Waltz, is going to have to face a very potentially unsympathetic Senate for his nominations. Several senators, including from the Republican side of the aisle, have suggested that it will, quote, be pretty brutal, end quote, in terms of how those kinds of conversations will go, even if he can make it. So, Ken, this was another mark of the first Trump presidency. There seemed to be a lot more discipline in one sense during, the second Trump presidency. The Waltz incident seems to be the outlier. Trump is not just kind of, even here, not doing what he did the first time and just axing someone immediately, but he certainly is reshuffling, and that seems pretty clear. What does this indicate to you?
Well, one thing I wonder about it almost seems overdetermined that Waltz had to go, because besides the Signal chat incident that you mentioned, there's also this other thing that Laura Loomer wanted Waltz to go independently of the Signal chat thing, right? That was one of the people, and he did already fire a lot of other people that Laura Loomer had on her list who had nothing to do with the Signal chat issues. So it's hard to know what was driving this the most. I also think it's just another little way that Trump can kind of throw some shade on the UN and sort of signal how much disrespect he has for the UN, that he's basically saying, a person who's totally unfit to be part of my administration, I'm gonna usher them out to be ambassador to the UN. The one thing Trump may not have realized about that, though, is national security advisor position doesn't require Senate confirmation. So Waltz has never been through a Senate confirmation hearing, but by trying to sort of shove him off on the UN, that position does require a Senate confirmation hearing. So that's going to give the Senate Dems in particular, and I think a handful of Senate Republicans who are equally alarmed about it.
Well, as I just mentioned, several of them, several of them have already come out and said that, Republicans saying, I think there's going to be some problems here with Waltz.
Right. And maybe Trump doesn't even care. Like maybe he'd rather, run the risk that Waltz won't get through than make it look like he backed down on supporting Waltz. Like, if he went to the Senate and nominated him for the UN, he can always say, I didn't fire him just because people were criticizing him. I just tried to give him a transfer, but the Senate wouldn't let him have his transfer. But I do think the general message of like, well, if someone's not fit to be part of the government, then a good thing to do with them is make them ambassador to the UN. It's a way of signaling disrespect for the UN.
Oh, absolutely. But again, this is, and I think you're right in this terms, I don't think Trump precisely cares what happens in the Senate. But it will be a useful gauge because it's a low stakes. It's a very low stakes item. And to this point, the Republicans in the Senate have not been real willing to go up against Trump in any meaningful way, right? I mean, even earlier in the week, I was happy to see Senator Rand Paul making the attempt to claw back some of the overreach of President Trump's, or really any executive overreach power in terms of tariffs. And the Senate couldn't even get on board with that. But so this seems like an even lower level than that. So I do think it'll be a useful benchmark to see, is there anything on which we're going to see some disagreement? Because I think if Waltz waltzes through to the UN, I don't think there's much reason to believe that there's any circumstance in which the Senate Republicans are going to beat any kind of check on Trump. But I think here, if we see some strong language, we see some negative votes, I think that might be a bad sign especially if you were working in the Trump administration. So to kind of wait and see on that front. But that would be my take.
I agree. And all of that is partly going to be related to where Trump's approval rating numbers are, the day of the vote, and how much like each senator thinks they really need him on their side. So all those things will be rolled into it. I'm also sure a lot of senators couldn't care less who's the ambassador to the UN. So I agree with you. They're going to think it's a very low stakes kind of vote, more of a messaging vote than a vote of any significance.
But now I do want to spend a lot of time. Let's move away from Trump. We've spent a lot of time in his 100 days, and we're not exactly moving away from Trump, but I want to dig into something kind of its more own independent story today. And that was, a federal district court finding that the Alien Enemies Act is invocation was illegal. And it's pretty crazy on that front, Ken, because it happens in a very unlikely location, Texas, and it comes from a Trump-appointed federal judge, Fernando Rodriguez. And Judge Rodriguez has found that President Donald Trump's use of that Alien Enemies Act is unlawful because the Venezuelan criminal gang in question is not, in fact, invading the United States. Now, this only applies to deportations under the AEA, not other detentions. But the language of the 36-page opinion, which I've read, is pretty straightforward. In Rodriguez's words, it is, quote, unlawful and, quote, exceeds the scope, end quote, of the law. As Judge Rodriguez wrote, quote, the president cannot summarily declare that a foreign national or government has threatened or perpetuated an invasion or predatory incursion of the United States, followed by the identification of alien enemies subject to detention or removal, end quote. The administration's argument was that the gang is a hybrid criminal state, which is in fact invading the United States. But Judge Rodriguez found no evidence to support that claim. In his words, quote, allowing the president to unilaterally define the conditions when he may invoke the AEA and then summarily declare that those conditions exist would remove all limitations to the executive branch's authority under the AEA and would strip the courts of their traditional role of interpreting congressional statutes to determine whether a government official has exceeded the statute's scope. The law does not support such a position, end quote. Now, as a reminder, this is the law that was used to deport 2 plane loads of alleged gang members. And as we and the other politics guys have examined, both in the immediate deportations with myself and Ken, and then later with the United States Supreme Court split 5-4 decision to lift an injunction by a federal judge in Washington, D.C., which also halted the deportation under the AEA, but said that those detainees must be given due process to challenge their removal in the district in which they were detained, is the milieu into which this week's decision by Rodriguez comes to the fore. And this is a big deal because to this point, President Trump has really been on the offensive rhetorically against the court. As a matter of fact, this past week, not directly, but indirectly, there has been oh my goodness, Supreme Court Jackson mentioned explicitly in her conversations about the threats and the attacks of the court, although not using President Trump by name. And in the past, he's called judges like this radical leftists, crazies. There have been impeachment proceedings against them. This seems a little bit less likely, although not impossible in this particular instance, again, because we're in Texas, and this is a Trump appointee. So, Ken, not only am I curious on your take in terms of Rodriguez's ruling, I'm also interested in your take on what the angle from the White House will be this time, given that we're actually talking about solely a Trump appointee.
Yeah, I mean, if Trump can't win in front of one of his own appointees in Texas, there must be something wrong with his arguments, right? And of course there is. There's only one time in American history when America was actually declared war against a non-state actor. That happened right after the September 11th attacks and in 2001. And Congress invoked the War Powers Resolution, which is the modern way that Congress declares war. And they invoked it against Al-Qaeda and any other terrorist organizations, could be non-state organizations that were in fact behind the September 11th attacks. And that was controversial at the time. Is it even possible to declare war against a non-state actor? And I guess it was settled, just by the court of history more than by, there was really no judicial case over that particular issue. But it seems like maybe it's possible for Congress to declare war against a non-state actor. But what wasn't at issue, even in that case in 2001, is who declares war? I mean, that was Congress. Congress enacted that authorization for use of military force. Congress triggered the War Powers Resolution. The president cannot engage in unilaterally declaring war against a country. That power is, or against a non-state actor. That power is squarely vested in Congress by the Constitution, the power to declare war. So even if it was possible for Congress to declare war against this gang from Venezuela, the way they, I guess, did against Al-Qaeda, they didn't do it. And there's just zero argument that the president alone can declare a war, start a war, fight a war, and leave the Congress solely out of it. And so really that's what the judge, held. And I think that's an absolutely unassailable holding. And given that the contemporary Supreme Court, did rein in Trump in the Garcia Abrego case already by a substantial majority, I'm a little more confident than I would have been a couple weeks ago that there's really no risk that they'll go the wrong way on that question, that they would support what this district judge did. Now, I think the Fifth Circuit could come in between before, after if the administration appeals, they're going to appeal it to the Fifth Circuit before it gets to the Supreme Court. And depending on the luck of the draw, I think there are, they could get a 3-judge panel on the Fifth Circuit, filled with Justice Alito types who are determined to rule for Trump no matter what. And it is possible that this district judge could get reversed at the Fifth Circuit. But if that happens, it'll go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will reinstate the district court's order.
It seems a little less likely to me that the Fifth is going to overrule this, given that, I mean, I hear your point of view about wanting, the kind of the Alito view of, I want to vote for the president. But Rodriguez would be an example of an individual who you might suggest would be doing similar kinds of things and rules voraciously the opposite direction. I think because this is probably the most clearly unconstitutional act that the Trump administration has taken, and it lies directly in an area where even conservative scholars are not willing and have never been willing to go. I mean, even Wu, the kind of the most traditional, very powerful unitary executive view of the presidency in his unitary theory, never did not go this far, even even in his kind of theoretic arguments back surrounding during the George W. Bush administration. So I agree, but I don't think the Fifth will end up being an override.
Well, I'm not saying it necessarily will. I'm just saying depending which three judges they get, there's a roll of the dice there. Yeah.
But now, what do you think in terms of? And this is where I don't have a good answer. The Supreme Court did lift an injunction, I think, in part to relieve some of the pressure from the White House in terms of this. We don't want district courts to have injunctions, and here we have an injunction again. What do you think on that front?
I think that's an interesting point. So that's about the issue of nationwide injunctions.
Yes.
And so this it's implicated in some cases and not others. So there's a lot of controversy around the question of whether a federal district judge in a case between a party and the government can issue an order that not only lets the party defeat the government, but also applies to every other similarly situated party in the whole United States, no matter whether or not they're actually before the court. So that's the issue of nationwide injunctions. But there's also such a thing as a class action, which can properly be brought. So that you can have a class of people who are similarly situated certified as a class, and then a class action can run for the benefit of everybody that's in the certified class. So there actually are ways to get the same thing as nationwide injunctions in court, and the controversy is really around whether the district judge is allowed to skip the steps of having a class certified for a class action and just jump straight to giving a judgment against the government that runs for the benefit of everybody in the United States, or whether there first has to be a class of plaintiffs certified. Here, I think that'll become less of an issue because it would be easy enough to certify as a class everybody who's a member of the Tren. I can't remember the name. Tren Daragua, is that the name of the gang?
Yes.
So the Tren Daragua gang and every member it has could bring a class action because the Trump order was directed at that gang and all its members. So it's not that different in principle than these law firms that are challenging his orders against them, on behalf of all their partners, right? So that each partner doesn't have to bring their own action. The law firm can bring the action, and it's on behalf of all of the partners. That can be done in a case like this where you've got a kind of definition of who's in the class and who's not. So I think in this case, that's a more hyper-technical point. In some other kinds of cases, it's a more serious point because it's hard to define exactly who would be in the class of plaintiffs.
The reason I wondered about it in this case was because it seems to me that the gang itself would not necessarily be the legal class, but rather the individuals who are being rounded up because they are assumed to be in the gang, right? And so would the class of individuals be, that was what had given me pause. Does that make sense what I'm suggesting there?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, but there's an answer to it.
Okay, please, yeah.
Yeah, so you only need to certify that the class is the class of people who are actually in the gang. Because if you can get a court order that it's not permissible for the government to deport people based on their membership in the Tren de Aragua gang, then, it's just automatically must logically follow that if you couldn't deport them because they're in the gang, you can't deport them because you think they're in the gang, right? And so,
Okay, I see.
right,
Okay, that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah. Because if the belief that they were in the gang was accurate, that wouldn't justify deporting them. So therefore, ergo, an inaccurate belief that they're in the gang also can't justify deporting them. And so I think that's the essence of what the district judge did hold, is that if someone's in the Tren de Aragua gang, they are not an alien enemy. That an alien enemy would have to be a citizen of a country that Congress has declared war against, or perhaps under the September 11th precedent, a member of an organization that Congress has invoked the War Powers Resolution against. So maybe it wouldn't have to be a country, but Congress has to have done the declaration of who we're at war with. And if Congress hasn't done that, we're not at war. And if we're not at war, whether it's a war against Venezuela or whether it's a war against Tren de Aragua, then someone who's Venezuelan or someone who's in Tren de Aragua is not an enemy alien, and they can't be deported under the Alien Enemies Act.
Okay. I appreciate that. See, that's why I love having you on the show, because you can kind of get into some of those details, and I love that. Now, we don't have a ton of time left, but I do at least want to hit one more breaking story that we had talked about right before the show began, and that was here again on Friday, May 2nd. President Donald Trump put out his kind of budget blueprint to Congress, and it's this. We're still looking at it. I have not had a lot of time to delve into the details of it. I had my graduation ceremonies today for Oklahoma Christian, and so I've really just had about, we'll say 25 minutes to really look at this in a big way. But it's something we wanted to talk about at least a little bit. He is seeking some really massive funding cuts across the federal government, which on paper, I would be kind of okay with. The overall non-defense programs slash looks to be somewhere in the vicinity of $163 billion on that proposed Friday release. And it would cleave about 20% from federal coffers overall. That's a huge difference. But those spending reductions aren't going to just be a spending reduction, because a lot of that money appears to be headed back into some other items, especially on border and defense. And that's where it starts to get a little bit difficult here. We're kind of looking at it. Now, the White House has deemed this non-defense spending as quote unquote wasteful. And again, I'd be up for thinking about that kind of what might be known as like the president's skinny budget on that front. Now, it is worthwhile to recognize, just historically speaking, that these budget blueprints, and this is not just a Trump thing, they are routinely kind of ignored even by the president's party. In many ways, they're a wish list of things, symbolic, a chance to kind of show individuals where the priority of the White House is. But it generally comes back to Congress to kind of craft that bill. As a matter of fact, even here, House Appropriations Chair from here, my own state of Oklahoma, Tom Cole, told reporters, look, with all due respect to anybody, I think the members have a better understanding of what can pass and can't than the executive branch does, end quote. And again, that's not unusual. That's kind of what moves forward. But this is a pretty, this would be a huge cut to non-defense discretionary spending, and it would be an equally huge increase in spending towards defense items. And as you had pointed out, Ken, it looks like there's some other interesting portions to this budget. Any last thoughts about this budget proposal?
Yeah, well, some of the biggest cuts are to not where you'd expect them to be, I guess, and some of the smaller cuts are not where you'd expect them to be. So, for instance, we constantly hear Trump talking about how he's going to shut down the whole Department of Education. He does give a 15% cut to the Department of Education, which is a big cut. But, you never hear him talking about shutting down the National Science Foundation, but he gives a 56% cut to the National Science Foundation. So there's some, and that's against a much smaller base to begin with than the Education Department has. So there's this notion of maybe really, really, coming with the axe after some of the agencies that he wasn't really talking about. The cuts that are above 50% are basically the EPA, the NSF, National Science Foundation, and the State Department. Those are the three agencies that he's going to cut down extremely severely, more than 50% of their budget. With housing and urban development coming next, 44% cut. Department of Labor, 35% cut. Those don't really sound like the ones that he was bashing the most on the campaign trail. And, in dollar figures, as one of the biggest cuts is to Health and Human Services, and that's where you're going to find a lot of Medicaid. So even though he's been talking about maybe not cutting Medicaid, the budget that he proposed with the $33 billion cut to Health and Human Services, the reason it's $33 billion is not because that many employees work at Health and Human Services that they get paid $33 billion. It's because that's the money that's actually going out to pay for health benefits. And so there's an extremely massive cut there. And that's more or less the opposite of his campaign rhetoric. Whereas things like the education department that he talks about cutting, he's not cutting them nearly as much. He keeps spending flat at the Social Security Administration and at the VA. And then there's the very dramatic increases, defense and homeland security. For defense, defense's budget is already huge. So a 13% increase, which may not sound as huge as some of these 40 and 50% numbers that other agencies are seeing, but a 13% increase in defense means $113 billion. That's, much more of an increase than, any three departments put together are getting in a cut. And then homeland security, its budget isn't as big as defense, but it is getting a 65% increase. So that's pretty much ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, I think.
Yeah.
Very massive increase there.
The only one item that I might add to yours that I had seen in my cursory overview would be the almost 2.5, the 2.49 billion cut to the IRS. That the argument there being that we need to end, quote, the weaponization of IRS enforcement, end quote. But what I kind of read as we don't want rich people to pay their taxes.
Yeah, I mean, a $2.4 billion cut to the IRS is going to cost $500 billion in uncollected taxes.
Well, yeah,
so
and that's what you're getting to. I mean, that one is that it is unique because, again, the IRS is a law enforcement agency in a way, and yet that's the one that Trump is the least fond of. I suppose would be one way of putting that kindly. I suppose.
Right. So if he didn't have any tax cuts, this budget would be essentially bottom line neutral, except for the fact that the IRS cuts are going to cost $500 billion in collections. But then he also wants to pair that with a lot of tax cuts as well, which could increase us to several $1 trillion budget deficit.
Which and Rand Paul and a few Republicans have been willing to call out against that, but it is just baffling to me and frustrating beyond belief that we only care about deficits when we are the party not in power, and that always seems to be the case. But I'll put a pause on that because we have come to the end of our full-length weekend show. But that doesn't mean you've got to be done listening to me and Ken, right? Because he and I, in just a few minutes, as we always do, well, at least have for a long time now, a number of years now, be moving to recording our supporters exclusive midweek show. And this week we're going to be tackling the 20th and the 20th Amendment. So if you'd like to get that and so much more, it's time to become a supporter of the Politics Guys. So go ahead right now and head over to patreon.com/politicsguys and become a supporter. It's really easy to do. There's all different kinds of plans. Check it all out in the show notes on Patreon or head on the web to politicsguys.com/support. That's how you're going to be able to get all of our show and not just a little 15-minute preview of it. We'd love to have you continue that conversation as we get to the 20th and 22nd Amendment and we get close to wrapping up the United States Constitution this year, which is going to be a lot of fun. I know we've been looking forward to that. It is also helpful if you subscribe, rate, or review our show. We need those algorithms. The AI is brutal. So please share this and any other episode that you found fun with myself or any of the other Politics Guys. A special thanks as we finish the show to the executive producers of the Politics Guys, who are William Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Kathy Anderson, and Jeremy Larson. Thank you each and every one to make this show possible. We'll be back with a new full episode next week, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.